Before medicine had a language of science, it had a language of fear. Illness was not a malfunction of the body. It was a message from the heavens. A fever meant divine anger. A seizure meant possession. When livestock collapsed in the fields and children burned with unexplained heat, communities did not look inward to biology. They looked upward to the gods. In villages across the ancient Mediterranean, rituals replaced diagnosis. Sacrifices replaced observation. Disease was not studied. It was endured. Humans and animals shared the same vulnerability, but neither shared understanding. Suffering was interpreted, not investigated. Then, in the 5th century BCE, something extraordinary happened. A small group of thinkers began to ask a forbidden question. What if disease is not punishment, but process? On the island of Kos, a physician named Hippocrates proposed an idea radical enough to reshape civilization. Diseases have natural causes. They are not sent by gods. They arise from the environment, the seasons, the water, the air, and the internal balance of the body. This shift was more than medical. It was philosophical. It moved responsibility from the altar to observation. It replaced superstition with pattern recognition. Epilepsy, once called the sacred disease, was declared no more sacred than any other illness. It was a condition of the brain, not a curse of Olympus. For the first time in recorded history, disease became something that could be studied systematically, in humans and in animals alike. Hippocratic medicine introduced classification. Acute and chronic illnesses, seasonal patterns, environmental influences. The body was understood through the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. While modern science no longer accepts this theory, the methodology it inspired remains foundational. Observation, documentation, comparison. These tools transformed medicine from ritual into inquiry. They laid the groundwork for epidemiology, for veterinary science, for public health. The same logic used to understand a human fever could be applied to a dying herd. Nature, it seemed, followed rules. And once rules exist, they can be discovered. The true revolution of Hippocratic thought was not that it got everything right. It was that it dared to look for explanations in nature rather than in myth. That courage reshaped humanity's relationship with suffering. When we stopped blaming the gods, we began examining ourselves. When we observed patterns instead of omens, medicine became a science. And in that transformation, both human and animal life gained something extraordinary: the possibility of understanding. This is the story of the moment disease became natural and knowledge became power. Before medicine became a science, it was a negotiation with the gods. In the ancient world, illness did not begin in the body. It began in the heavens. A child's fever was not a symptom. It was a signal, a warning, a sign that something unseen had been disturbed. Families gathered around trembling bodies, not with thermometers or diagnoses, but with prayers whispered into uncertain air. Firelight flickered against mud brick walls as fear spread faster than the heat beneath the child's skin. In the same village, beyond the stone boundary, cattle collapse without explanation. Strong animals that plowed fields at sunrise lie motionless by dusk. Shepherds watch helplessly as sheep stagger, foam at the mouth, and fall. The pattern feels intentional. First the child, then the herd. To ancient eyes, this was not coincidence. It was judgment. When humans fell ill, the gods were displeased. When animals died, the gods were enraged. Priests step forward where physicians do not yet exist. Incense replaces investigation. Altars replace laboratories. A goat is led to sacrifice in hopes that divine anger might be redirected. Disease is not studied, it is appeased. Questions are dangerous because questioning implies doubt, and doubt implies defiance. In a world ruled by invisible forces, Survival depends on obedience, not understanding. What makes this moment powerful is not ignorance. It is vulnerability. Humans and animals share the same water, the same soil, the same air heavy with unseen agents. They suffer together, but they interpret suffering through myth. There is no concept of bacteria, no framework for contagion, no vocabulary for immunity, only narrative, only belief, only fear. And yet, buried within that fear is the beginning of something revolutionary. Because every time a child survived, every time a herd recovered, someone somewhere must have wondered, what if this is not punishment? What if it follows rules? What if disease is not a curse, but a condition? Long before rational medicine emerged in Greece, great civilizations had already attempted to explain disease, but through a sacred lens. In ancient Mesopotamia, illness was carefully documented on clay tablets, yet its cause was rarely biological. It was spiritual. A fever could mean that a god had been offended. Paralysis could signal demonic interference. Priests and exorcists worked side by side, reciting incantations designed to identify which deity had been angered and which ritual might restore balance. Diagnosis was not about anatomy. It was about morality. In ancient Egypt, medicine was more advanced in practice, yet still entangled with theology. Medical papyri described symptoms with striking precision, but treatments blended herbal remedies with spells and invocations. The body was not an independent system. It was a vessel within a cosmic order. If disorder appeared in flesh, it reflected disorder in spirit. Even animal illnesses were treated within this framework. When cattle sickened or plagues swept through livestock, rituals were performed to appease divine forces believed to govern fertility and harvest. The health of animals and humans alike was interpreted as a reflection of divine harmony. This worldview shaped the concept later known in Greece as the sacred disease. Epilepsy, with its sudden seizures, convulsions, and loss of consciousness, seemed unmistakably supernatural. How else could a healthy individual collapse without warning, speak incoherently, or appear overtaken by an invisible force? The dramatic nature of the condition reinforced belief in possession or divine punishment. The more mysterious the symptoms, the stronger the spiritual explanation. Within this framework, illness became more than a physical condition. It became a moral verdict. Sickness implied wrongdoing. A community facing epidemic might search not for contamination, but for guilt. Someone must have violated a taboo. Someone must have angered the gods. The body was evidence in a cosmic courtroom. For centuries, this interpretive model dominated human thinking. It was not foolish. It was coherent within the limits of available knowledge. But it was a frame that misidentified the source of suffering. By attributing disease to divine will, humanity postponed the investigation of natural cause. The tragedy was not belief itself. It was the confinement of curiosity. The wrong question had been asked for generations. And when the question is wrong, even intelligent minds circle endlessly around the wrong answer. In the 5th century BCE, on the small Aegean island of Kos, a physician emerged whose ideas would fracture centuries of sacred certainty. His name was Hippocrates, not a magician, not a priest, not a prophet, a physician. In a world where disease was interpreted through myth, he proposed something dangerously simple. Look at the patient. The medical school associated with Kos did not revolve around rituals or divine appeasement. It revolved around observation. Physicians recorded symptoms carefully. They tracked the progression of illness day by day. They noted changes in weather, water sources, diet, and living conditions. Patterns began to emerge, not cosmic patterns, but natural ones. Disease appeared to follow climate. It followed seasons. It followed environment. It followed the body itself. Then came the thesis that would redefine medicine. Diseases have natural causes. They are not punishments sent by gods. They arise from internal imbalance and external conditions. This statement was not merely clinical, it was revolutionary. It relocated the origin of suffering from Olympus to physiology. It implied that understanding, not sacrifice, was the path to healing. Consider epilepsy, the so-called sacred disease. In a treatise attributed to the Hippocratic tradition, it was argued that this illness was no more divine than any other. Its dramatic seizures were frightening, yes, but fear does not equal holiness. The text insisted that epilepsy originated in the brain, not in divine wrath, not in demonic possession, in the brain. Pause for a moment and feel the magnitude of that claim. To say that a mysterious, terrifying condition had a biological origin was to challenge the intellectual foundation of an entire culture. It required courage to shift attention from altars to anatomy, from prayer to pulse, from myth to method. This was the turning point. Medicine stepped away from negotiation with gods and toward investigation of nature. The body became a system to be studied rather than a battlefield of invisible forces. And once the door to natural explanation opened, it would never fully close again. Once disease was brought down from the heavens to the body, a new challenge emerged. How do you organize suffering? Observation alone was not enough. Patterns had to be structured. Differences had to be named. Hippocratic medicine introduced something subtle but transformative: classification. Illness was no longer a single chaotic force. It could be divided. Some diseases were acute, sudden, intense, and short-lived. Others were chronic, slow, persistent, woven into the fabric of daily life. This distinction may sound obvious today, but at the time, it was radical. It suggested that diseases behaved differently over time, that they followed trajectories, that they had internal logic. Physicians also began to track seasonal influence. Certain fevers appeared in summer. Respiratory conditions intensified in winter. Environmental exposure, water quality, wind direction, soil conditions seemed to matter. Disease was no longer random. It interacted with climate and geography. Humans and animals living in the same environment often developed similar patterns of illness. The land itself became part of diagnosis. At the center of this framework stood the humoral theory. The body, according to Hippocratic thought, was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance. Disease was imbalance. Excess heat, excess cold, excess dryness, excess moisture. These qualities disrupted harmony within the body. Treatment aimed not to expel demons, but to restore equilibrium. Modern medicine does not accept this theory as biologically accurate. There are no measurable black bile reservoirs within the spleen. The chemistry is wrong. The physiology is incomplete. But dismissing it entirely misses the deeper achievement. For the first time, disease was framed as a system governed by internal regulation. Symptoms were not random punishments. They were consequences of imbalance. And here lies the true revolution. The power of Hippocratic medicine was not that it produced perfectly correct answers. It was that it asked structured questions. What changes over time? What correlates with climate? What differs between patients? What remains consistent? These questions created a method. And method is the backbone of science. The essence of science is not possessing the right answer from the beginning. It is constructing a disciplined way to approach the unknown. The humors may have been incorrect in detail, but the habit of systematic inquiry, classification, comparison, hypothesis reshaped medicine permanently. Once disease could be categorized, it could be studied. Once studied, it could eventually be understood. When Hippocratic medicine placed disease within nature, it did something even more profound. It placed humans within nature as well. No longer separate from the environment, no longer uniquely punished or divinely targeted, the human body became subject to the same forces that shaped every living creature. The air that entered human lungs entered animal lungs. The water drawn from a well-nourished both child and cattle. The soil that fed crops fed entire ecosystems. Health was no longer isolated, it was ecological. Environmental factors began to reveal their shared influence. Poor water quality did not discriminate between species. Contaminated sources produced illness in households and herds alike. Stagnant air, marshlands, extreme heat. These conditions shaped patterns of fever across villages and pastures. Nutrition, too, followed universal logic. Malnourished animals weakened just as malnourished humans did. Deficiency produced vulnerability. Vulnerability invited disease. Nature did not distinguish between farmer and livestock. This recognition quietly introduced the foundations of what we now call epidemiology, the study of how disease spreads within populations. Long before microbes were visible, patterns were visible. Illness moved through cities the way it moved through herds. It clustered. It followed trade routes. It intensified in dense environments. Observation revealed that disease was not random punishment falling from the sky. It behaved like a phenomenon moving through connected bodies. Hippocratic thought reframed humanity not as the center of creation, but as a participant in a larger biological system. Humans were part of the same environmental web as animals. This conceptual shift mattered deeply. If disease could emerge from shared conditions, then understanding those conditions could protect multiple species at once. The logic that explained a seasonal fever in humans could explain weakness in cattle. The land, the water, the climate, these became common denominators. In this intellectual movement lies the distant origin of veterinary science. The idea that animals experience disease through natural mechanisms, not divine symbolism, opened the path toward systematic animal medicine. Today's veterinary epidemiology, herd health management, and environmental health sciences stand on this early foundation. The realization was simple but transformative. Life shares biology, and shared biology shares risk. When disease moved from the realm of gods to the realm of nature, something else shifted quietly but permanently: responsibility. If illness was no longer divine punishment, then healing was no longer divine negotiation. The physician was no longer a mediator between humanity and supernatural forces. The physician became accountable to the patient. From this transformation emerged one of the most enduring ethical texts in history, the Hippocratic Oath. Attributed to the Hippocratic tradition, it was more than a ceremonial pledge. It defined boundaries. It established duties. It declared that medical knowledge must serve life, not power. To treat the sick according to one's ability and judgment. To do no harm. To respect confidentiality. These principles reframed medicine as a moral discipline grounded in care rather than ritual. This was a profound redefinition of the healer's role. The physician was no longer an interpreter of divine anger, but a trained observer of human biology. Authority shifted from sacred status to disciplined expertise. Trust was no longer based on proximity to the gods, but on commitment to evidence and compassion. Knowledge demanded humility. Observation demanded restraint. And this is where emotion rises. Because once disease is understood as natural, suffering becomes something we are responsible for confronting, not appeasing, not blaming, confronting. Science did not only produce explanations, it produced obligation. If patterns can be studied, they can be interrupted. If causes can be identified, they can be mitigated. Ignorance is no longer destiny. It becomes negligence. This ethical awakening extended beyond human patience. If animals suffer through natural mechanisms, then their suffering is not symbolic. It is biological. It deserves attention. It deserves intervention. The same principles of observation, care, and non-maleficence apply. In this sense, Hippocratic thought planted early seeds of a broader moral horizon, that life, whether human or animal, carries intrinsic value within the natural order. Medicine, then, became more than knowledge of the body. It became stewardship of life. The shift from divine intermediary to scientific observer did not diminish the sacred. It relocated it. The sacred was no longer in appeasing unseen forces, but in protecting vulnerable beings through understanding. More than 2,000 years have passed since the Hippocratic shift, yet its intellectual echo still shapes every hospital corridor and veterinary clinic. Modern medicine may rely on microscopes, genetic sequencing, and advanced imaging technologies, but its foundation remains unmistakably Hippocratic. Observe carefully, classify precisely, search for natural cause. Clinical observation, the disciplined act of watching, recording, comparing, remains the heartbeat of medical practice. A physician listening to lung sounds, tracing symptom progression, correlating exposure history. This is not ancient superstition refined. It is ancient methodology evolved. The tools have changed, the questions have deepened, but the structure of inquiry remains rooted in that decisive moment when disease was recognized as part of nature. Our capacity to understand epidemics rests on this same foundation. When outbreaks occur, we no longer search for divine anger. We track transmission pathways. We map clusters. We analyze environmental conditions, population density, and biological vectors. Epidemiology, public health strategy, quarantine systems, all depend on the premise that disease follows discoverable rules. That premise was revolutionary in the 5th century BCE. Today, it is assumed. And this legacy extends equally to animal health. When a veterinarian analyzes herd immunity, studies feed quality, or investigates a pattern of respiratory illness in livestock, the method being applied is conceptually Hippocratic. Identify variables. Observe patterns. Seek natural explanation. Whether in a rural pasture or an urban emergency room, the intellectual lineage is clear. What makes this historical moment enduring is not perfection of theory. The humoral model was flawed. The biology was incomplete. But the methodological courage, the decision to replace myth with investigation, altered humanity's trajectory. It gave us a framework capable of self-correction, a system that improves because it questions. When we stopped blaming the gods, we started understanding life. And in that understanding, we gained not only knowledge, but agency. The power to intervene, the power to protect, the power to care with intention rather than fear. That is why this moment still matters. Because every diagnosis made today, every epidemic mapped, every life preserved through evidence-based care traces back to the same turning point, the decision to look at nature and to trust that it can be understood. Today, when we speak about epilepsy, once called the sacred disease, we no longer invoke divine mystery. We speak the language of neuroscience. We understand it as a neurological disorder characterized by abnormal electrical activity in the brain. Seizures are not messages from the heavens. They are measurable disruptions in neuronal signaling. Treatment has evolved accordingly. Anti-seizure medications stabilize neural activity for millions of patients worldwide. For drug-resistant cases, surgical interventions can remove or disconnect the seizure focus. Neurostimulation devices, such as vagus nerve stimulation, modulate electrical signaling. Dietary therapies, like the ketogenic diet, first systematized in the early 20th century, remain clinically relevant. Research continues into gene-targeted therapies and precision medicine approaches tailored to individual biology. And yet, the arc from Hippocrates today is not merely technological, it is methodological. Each advancement follows the same blueprint. Observe, hypothesize, test, refine. Clinical trials replace speculation. Data replaces fear. Responsibility guides innovation. The journey is not finished. Epilepsy still affects over 50 million people globally. Access to diagnosis and treatment remains unequal. Science advances, but equity must advance with it. The work continues in laboratories, clinics, and communities. But consider the magnitude of the transformation. Once, seizures were signs of divine intervention. Now they are electrical storms we can measure, predict, and often control. This is the enduring power of that ancient intellectual rebellion. When we stopped blaming the gods, we started understanding life. And when we understood life, we learned how to protect it. If this story expanded your perspective, if it helped you see medicine not just as technology, but as an evolving way of thinking, then you are already part of this journey. Subscribe to the channel to explore more turning points where science challenged belief and curiosity reshaped civilization. Like the video so it reaches others who value evidence over assumption. Share your thoughts in the comments, your insights, your critiques, your questions. Real progress begins in dialogue. In our next episode, we'll step further into the evolution of medical thought and uncover another moment when humanity chose investigation over superstition and changed its future in the process. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and most importantly, take care of your health and the health of the lives around you. A healthy mind, a healthy body, a thoughtful world.